We're not doing doom and gloom. Doom and gloom does not sell newspapers.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. In June 2022, I attended the final day of the Footprint Plus Sustainability Conference in Brighton. The whole conference was about decarbonising the property sector, and it featured some really inspiring talks. The voice you heard at the start was Tim Pine, creative director of the conference, and he described it to me like this.
The reason we've done this is that we felt that there was a huge need for people to actually get in the same place and talk to each other. The whole property industry is trying to reduce its carbon footprint because at the moment they're at 40%, which is huge, but they don't really know how to do it. So what we did was we went off and found 195, I think it was, of the cleverest minds that we could possibly find in the UK. And we said, come and talk to the property industry and teach them how to do it. And that's what we produced. And it's been absolutely fantastic.
So we're on day 3 of the conference now. First day for me, but obviously you've been here soaking it all in. What have been your big takeaways so far?
Well, just the fact that everybody's so passionate about it. You know, everybody's applauding at the end of every single talk. The lecture theatres are rammed. The bar is full of people, all talking to each other, all meeting each other. It's been exactly what we dreamed that it could be.
Armed with my microphone, I managed to grab just a small selection of the speakers, exhibitors and attendees at the conference for short interviews. So this episode is a snapshot of that day and a flavour of the cutting-edge thinking, designing and innovating that are happening in the sector. In this episode, you will hear about a range of topics, including energy, building materials, embodied carbon, technology and new working practices. And I asked people my classic question, which is, what do we need to do over the next decade to ensure effective climate action? I have no doubt that you'll find nuggets of wisdom and exciting ideas in this episode, and I think in general it's very positive and optimistic, which is nice for a change. One thing I will say is that the range of people I interviewed for this episode is not very diverse. All the voices you will hear are men with English accents. I'm not particularly happy with that. I would have preferred to have gotten a much broader diversity of speakers, but in the relative chaos of the day, these are the people I managed to grab for interviews. Early in the day, I caught up with Barney Evans, who is a director at Turley and an expert in energy. He took me through the energy transition that we're currently undergoing and what needs to happen in the next decade. We also discuss decarbonising transport and why he thinks the future isn't all about public transport. We're in this decade of action, as I said. What do you think we need to do over the next decade to ensure successful climate action?
Okay. So I think talking from a climate change mitigation perspective, which is really my area of understanding, if you wanted to summarise it in a sentence, you would say you need to generate a lot of clean energy, renewable energy. You need to electrify all the demands so they can use all that clean energy, and then you need to balance the system. That's the next 30 years in a sentence, or 20 years in a sentence. So what you need to do in the next decade, I think, is still the rollout of the renewable energy and the electrification of the demand. I think that will be the focus. I think in terms of the energy generation, so the clean energy bit, I think we've already reached a tipping point where it's sort of, it'll just happen on its own momentum now. Solar power is so cheap, wind power is so cheap and getting cheaper all the time, and they'll become our predominant energy sources. On the demand side, it's slower, and it's also a bit more bitty. So we've just listened to Greg Clark when we were talking about future cities, and he was talking about electrification. There's the building, the main two issues are the buildings, where we've got heat, is the primary issue, and we need to electrify that, and that's going very slowly, so we need a lot of action on that. And then on transport, it's happening a bit quicker, because I think, again, they're beginning to generate their own momentum now. Electric vehicles, and I mean all surface transport, so coaches, HGVs, cars, they're beginning to be their own logic of electrification is just for economic reasons. So it's just cheaper. So that's beginning to happen. So I think more action on that, I suppose. I think what if we're talking about a decade, maybe what will happen towards the end of the decade is we're going to need to be smarter about energy. And you're seeing some of that happen. So you're talking about energy storage and using energy at smart times, using more energy when there's lots of solar and wind and less energy when there's less solar and wind. And at the moment, the system doesn't really do that. So, for example, almost everyone residentially will be on a standard flat rate tariff for their electricity. That'll need to change, so with variable, so you're rewarded for charging your car or heating your water overnight. But I think we've probably got a bit of time for that because our system's still got some fat in it, still got some margin of error. But come the end of the decade, once you've got loads more wind and loads more electric vehicles and loads more heat pumps, they're going to have to be more sophisticated about how we balance them. So maybe that's the answer.
As a follow-up to that, because I think one of my big frustrations, in particular with to do with transport, is this sort of that you can't fight ideology with logic. So people have an ideology that they should be allowed to drive their car, and that makes it very difficult to invest in public transport and that kind of thing. Do you have any thoughts? Do you see that shifting, or do you have any thoughts about what might help that to shift?
Yeah, I do. So I think there's an interesting tension in transport. In fact, I'm appalled at how bad our public transport ideas are. In that, so yeah, you're right. People like individual modes of transport, and local authorities and cities, and I think even people like us think it's good to have public transport. And so, but what they tend to have is these big things. So it's bus routes, it's trams, it's train lines, and so on. Now, I think the challenge for transport is that isn't the future of it. Definitely not the future of intra-urban transport. When you can get an electric scooter that moves you around at 15 miles an hour for no cost whatsoever, making no noise, emitting no air pollution, we should be invested in them hugely. And we don't, because it just isn't in the mindset of government. What they want is big things, carriages, lines, things you can cut a ribbon on. So I think that's where we're going wrong. On your point about the private car, I think again, there's this sort of perception that it's a social good that we are mixed. We should, when you get on a train or a bus, you're mixing with the other people, and that's good for the society. I don't think that's going to last. I don't think it'll survive, because I think what we'll move into is these sort of pods moving around cities. And I think the big opportunity to get people out of their private cars and be more multimodal is car clubs. Every city should have a plan to roll out, either themselves or with private partners, a shared car solution that would enable everyone in that city to use cars but not own a car, and that would solve the problem. But again, I think it's just not in the mindset of government. I raise this with every time I talk to someone in transport cities. Why haven't you got a car club? I mean, it's just the gargantuan amount of space it would free up and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
The idea that we need a shift in mindset, something that popped up again and again throughout the day. In fact, it's something that another interviewee talked to me about. This is Joe Jack Williams of Field & Clegg Bradley Architects.
Hi, so my name's Joe Jack Williams. I'm an associate with Field & Clegg Bradley Studios. We're an architectural practice, and I look after their sustainability and their research on a day-to-day basis.
Excellent. Thank you for giving me the time. I'm going to ask you the question I ask everyone, which is what do we do over the next decade, or from your perspective, what needs to happen over the next decade to really take action on climate change?
Sure. I mean, it's an incredibly broad question, and I think there's obviously lots that need to happen. I think really the first step for me is just asking the questions. What's the carbon impact of this? So often there's so many things we do by habit or by proxy, or whether that's kind of just inbuilt in within how we work as an industry. So all these kind of processes, they've got an awful lot of inertia. And what it really takes is somebody just to ask the question, what's the carbon impact of this? Is there a better way of doing it that's more sustainable? And I think a lot of people haven't really asked that about a number of things. So that's where I see it. It's a really basic thing to do. But as soon as you start asking those questions, you start to think about the answers. Not always going to be an answer. Quite often there isn't. Eventually you'll find somebody who does know the answer. And that's the aim.
So you think there's a disruption needed to our working practices, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think procurement's necessarily broken, but I don't think it's effective. And I think this, we talk about value, but actually it gets conflated with cost. And I think actually value needs to incorporate those things like carbon. And I think as soon as you start to have those questions being raised within that procurement process, actually it comes back into that conversation.
Fantastic. We're here at Footprint. We've been here for a couple of hours now, and there's been a lot of interesting talks going on. what have been your sort of big takeaways?
I did catch a fantastic talk about the kind of think tank talking about heritage and net zero carbon. I got this real hunch that the people who do heritage buildings are the experts in retrofit. They are the ones who know everything about how to reuse buildings. Super complicated. All these kind of weight of the future of our cultural heritage is set on their shoulders, and they still manage to deliver buildings. So I think it was really interesting to see them engage with net zero carbon. I mean, Historic England were here talking about those kind of aspects and talking about social value of those buildings. So that, for me, super interesting. And only in 2 hours, that's the thing I saw. It's brilliant.
That's great, because I'm an urban designer, so I like to think about things quite on the big scale. And it seems obvious to me that historic environments, I mean, we're sitting here in Brighton, beautiful, historic, dense, walkable environment. These are the places that are, by default, the most sustainable.
Absolutely. And we're having a discussion at the minute. In fact, I was talking to a few people we've seen here, a few people we've worked with over the past, talking about actually when's too tall for a building. Because you do have this kind of funny balance. Actually, you kind of want dense living because of all the sustainable benefits that come with it. The same token, tall buildings inherently aren't sustainable. They're really difficult to make a low-carbon tall building. So what's the balance? Actually, there isn't a real answer for it yet. And we have been working with some groups to try and look into this. But yeah, haven't got the answer yet. But we will get there. But I think you're right. I think walkable cities, brilliant. I look at the fuel price crisis going on. Absolutely abhorrent. It's really terrible for a number of people. I don't have a car. I live in central London. I walk around. I walk to the end of my road and there's 4 greengrocers. I mean, 4 seems excessive, but there are 4 there, and they're all brilliant. And I use all of them because I feel guilty. But that's brilliant. So it is walkable cities. Those kind of bits. I mean, there's a difficulty about how do you grow and resource places like this. Where's that food coming from? So are we just moving that by proxy to a centre of a city? So I don't know, it's complicated, but I do agree. I think these walkable ideas and dense cities, I think it's great. You tend to get really good communities as a consequence.
While we're on the subject of tall buildings, just a plug that I did an episode a while back titled Are Tall Buildings Sustainable?, where I go through some of these issues. That's episode 16. Throughout the day, the topic of building materials was a huge debate among many of the speakers. One of the highlights for me, actually, was catching a talk by Amin Taha, Steve Webb and Pierre Bidot, titled Futuristic Stone. I bumped into Amin and Steve later on, and they filled me in on the amazing potential for low-carbon buildings and carbon sequestration if we go all in on timber and stone.
Hello, my name is Amin Taha. I'm a principal at Group Work Architects. Timber and stone, but let's start off with timber. So there's a Professor Rummage at Cambridge who's done a study of the woodlands that are being grown at the moment across Europe. They're being grown principally for economic reasons, because the idea of using timber for furniture, for construction is growing across Europe. That woodland is growing, and he's worked out just for those motivations alone, by 2030 there'll be enough woodland there to sequester about 25% of Europe's carbon dioxide emissions. Another British professor, Tom Crowther, this time at ETH Zurich, he's done exactly the same exercise across the planet. So imagine Scotland was cleared, the Highlands were cleared because its landlords realised they're going to make more money by clearing it and having sheep there instead of their tenant farmers and the small amount of money they got from woodland. Eventually wool didn't make them enough money, and now it's deer parks. Those deer are pretty much eating everything. No woodlands growing. Take those deer off, allow the woodland to grow back. Tom Crowther's done the same exercise across the planet. Land that's being cleared for past purposes that are no longer any use, whether that's sheep clearing or cattle clearing, etc. Land that's not earmarked for agricultural use, land that's not earmarked for other sorts of development. He said there's about 1.7 billion hectares of that across the planet. If we replanted that, would be at with forests, would be at pre-industrial levels of atmospheric CO2 within 100 years. Now, if you combine Professor Rummage's and Professor Crowther's ideas, replant forestry, use part of that forestry for development, construction, whether it's furniture or actual buildings, you'd accelerate that 100 years. Because ultimately, you plant a forest, it begins to drop its carbon sequestration before it then equals out. Because obviously there's some wood growing, some of it's dying, it equals out. You take out at an optimum point some wood, you increase that medium point. Yeah, so you'll accelerate that carbon sequestration from 100 years to, who knows, maybe 70 years within our lifetimes.
I think something that I feel conflicted about when it comes to forestry, and I visited Scotland recently, is the fact that, obviously much prefer using timber or paper as opposed to plastic and concrete and that kind of thing. But then I look out over the monocultures of pine trees that are being grown, and I wonder, is there a more ecological way we can replant forests while still, getting the resources?
Yeah, no, absolutely. They have to be biodiverse and native, and I think that even most contemporary people who plant forests realise you'll get more out of your wood if it's biodiverse as opposed to monoculture.
And I'm Steve Webb, founder, director of Webb Yates Engineers. Yeah, so we've been working with Amin for a long time, and we've been working with timber for a long time, and a lot of criticisms that are levelled at timber are associated with fire and the durability of timber, using it outside. How strong is it? It's not that strong. And actually, we got in stone designing little staircases and things like that, but actually reinforcing stone with post-tensioning cables, and you can make really strong, effective structural sections out of bits of stone. And actually mixing this up with timber in a virtuous way means that you have two materials to use in a building. Stone is incredibly low carbon, it's very, very strong, it's much stronger than timber. And as you make the point about monocultural forestry, stone is a very powerful, succinct material to remove in volume at high strength, and has far less land use than stone to provide building materials. So and when we've designed post-tension stone beams, the equivalent section, so we have a piece in the RA Summer Show at the moment, a beam that cantilevers 5.5 meters sitting on a timber trestle. We worked out that the equivalent steel section to that has something like 15 times more carbon footprint than the stone one. So it's a really powerful decarbonizing tool. And if you have the two materials at your disposal when you make a building, put stone on the outside, use stone for the really heavy load-bearing parts, you get fire resistance from stone. You can build infrastructure with stone, bridges and tunnels, and obviously that's been done for centuries. And so we think that stone really needs to be reintroduced with modern methods of manufacturing, modern analysis and design techniques they didn't have, 100 years ago, the last time they were designing with stone, can really be reinvented as a new material. We're doing 2 or 3 buildings at the moment where we're building composites with timber. So we have timber beams with stone plates between them, the two things, stone working in compression, timber working in tension. It's very lightweight, has a little bit of thermal mass, it's got fire resistance, and it's just a wonderful palette of materials to build with.
So I'm from Galway in Ireland, in the west of Ireland, and all of the not all of them, but many historic buildings in Galway are just limestone. And in fact, probably all over Ireland, because it's just everywhere.
We have beautiful limestone in Ireland, right? Kilkenny and wonderful, and black limestone and around Dublin, and I think Ireland. All countries have stone. Not all countries have great quarrying industries. So quarrying in the UK is not as advanced as quarrying in France, for example, where they have really big industrial scale extraction. But it's a material that's the reason we keep building with brick, and brick is produced with brown coal, very polluting, very energetic, and it's used for contextual and historical reasons. Actually, stone fits into that contextual historical thing in townscape, and quite acceptable to the public, but also really low carbon and very strong. So Ireland, go stone.
So I always ask guests on my podcast the same final question. So this idea that we're in this decade of action in terms of taking action on climate change. From your perspective, what do you think needs to happen or change over the next decade?
If we think of the building industry, so the building industry apparently is a contributor, 40% contributor to atmospheric carbon. So that's construction and in use, so turning your heating on and all the rest of it. 50% of that is the actual materials that make up a building. You can make buildings carbon negative, in other words, build more to absorb more carbon if you cleverly combine stone and timber. This doesn't mean there will be no steel, there'll be no concrete. There'll always be a use of that. And when I say cleverly, it just means standing back and saying, okay, we've got used to the idea because in the past it wasn't a priority. But now it is a priority. Think about those materials. Do you actually need reinforced concrete and steel here instead of a piece of stone or a piece of timber? And actually, pretty much all countries don't. If you're in a high seismic zone and you need to reinforce your building to stop falling down, yes, but most countries don't. So it's a fairly straightforward answer. Get your building to be carbon negative in its structure. That's fairly straightforward. After that, reduce the amount of energy use, whether you're in a cold country by super insulating, in a hot country by allowing plenty of airflow.
Before I come to you, I'll ask a follow-up question on that, which is can you make use of timber and stone in retrofit for existing buildings? Because obviously a lot of the carbon emissions from the built environment are from existing buildings, not from, I suppose, things that will exist in 30 years.
Yes, I mean, retrofit's a big argument, but let's assume you are keeping a structure that you have found. Yeah. So that structure will potentially, if it was built over the last, say, 100 years, might be a concrete frame or a steel frame. You're stripping away that facade, maybe it's an old curtain wall or something similar. Well, you've got the superstructure there. Yes, you don't need stone or timber to hold up the structure of the building, but you can envelop it. So what can you envelop it with? Well, you might, because it's a conservation area or you want to be in context, a thin line of stone. That stone is what's called a self-supporting facade. It only needs to be one stone stacked up on another all the way up the building. It's not putting any load on the structure. All you have to do is pin it back to the structure to stop it wobbling about and falling into the street, as it were. That is then the new face of the building. Everything internally, all your partitions, the floor finishes, the doors, everything. Instead of aluminium partitions with plasterboard, highly energy intensive. Big aluminium's the worst for embodied carbon. Put in timber studs, plywood and veneered walls. I mean, knocking your suitcase as you go out of your flat against a timber wall instead of a white painted plasterboard wall. It's going to be a lot better in the long run, isn't it? That'll be the patina of living in a building as opposed to scuff marks which you have to sand back and paint. So you can still make your retrofit carbon negative that way.
Fantastic. Any thoughts from you?
Well, I mean, often making the argument, if you want a steel beam, go to Brazil, dig a big hole, take the iron ore to a blast furnace, take the blast furnace to a blending mill, produce some steel ingots, take those to a rolling mill, roll them out into I sections, take them to a fabrication workshop, fabricate them, take them to site and bolt them all together. I can fit a post-tensioning jack and a circular saw into a suitcase. People as inept as Amin and I could walk to a quarry tomorrow and we can dig out some stone, we can cut them into blocks, we can drill holes in them, and we can string them together with post-tensioning cable. The investment to supplant steel sections with stone sections, capital investment is nothing. It's not very good for GDP. But it's a very succinct, very quick solution, very powerful. In an era where, so I think that, the retrofit thing, people are talking about this. We have 20 million homes in the UK. It's going to cost £20,000 to refit every home with insulation. It's 400 billion quid to insulate Britain's homes. Nuclear power station costs 4 billion, something like that. So nuclear is always going to be the answer. And yet we continue to build with brick, we continue to build with steel, we continue to build with concrete. Much better answer to, it's like your boat is leaking. Do you plug the leak or do you get a bigger pump? It's arguably cheaper to get a bigger pump. But you could really very quickly rule out steel and concrete in large volumes, get rid of bricks, and really reduce the demand for nuclear replacement of coal and gas-fired power stations. It's a really easy thing to do, but they're very powerful lobbies. There's a lot of industrial infrastructure, a lot of inertia. People don't like the new, or in this case, the old, and or the different. But I think it's if aliens came to Earth and we said, we've got a carbon problem, and they said, well, you're surrounded by great heaps of rock. Why the hell are you making concrete? And it just seems utterly perverse, and that's my take on it.
While we're on the topic, building materials, Sam Jarrett, Head of Marketing and Communications at developer UNI, told me about something they're exploring called concretine.
we had our guy Mike Harrison on yesterday. He was talking about concretine, which is a new material which is a hybrid between concrete and graphene, pioneered in Manchester at the University of Manchester. And we did the world's ever first commercial pour of it. And there was a talk yesterday which was going on just to my right, which I caught bits of whilst I was stood on our stand. So yeah, we've had a really good time. It's been a great 3 days, and a lot of people seem to have had a good time as well.
So what's the story with concretine? Is it more sustainable? Does it have different properties?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to break it down into real layman's terms, but essentially it's quicker to set and to make. It's cheaper, and it reduces a hell of a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere. So potentially pioneering across the world if it's able to be scaled at that level. So we did a little trial at our site in Mayfield, which is a 30-acre redevelopment of a part of Manchester, right by Piccadilly Station. And we did the first pour late last year, and we made a roller disco out of it. So everyone's dancing on top, and nobody knows obviously that this is a pioneering, amazing thing. But it's there right now. So go and check it out. It's in the depot at Mayfield.
I did a bit of research into concretine following the event. It seems that by infusing concrete with graphene creates a much stronger material, reducing the need for steel reinforcement in the case of reinforced concrete, and reducing the overall amount of concrete needed by about 30%. Meaning, as you can imagine, less emissions overall if you're using a concrete structure. It's also cheaper to produce, as Sam mentioned, and can be used with existing concrete pouring technology and techniques, which I guess is one of its selling points. According to Manchester University, rolled out across the global building industry supply chain, the technology has the potential to shave 2% off worldwide emissions. To me, this falls into the category of doing a bit better in the short term. And it may well have a use as a stopgap measure as the construction industry moves towards a regenerative carbon negative model. But if our goal is net zero carbon and beyond, perhaps we need to be looking at more transformative solutions than slightly better concrete. I'll leave you to decide. Sam went on to tell me about their new development in Mayfield, Manchester, which, to be honest, sounded pretty awesome.
But yeah, we're trying to be really sustainable in our outlook at Mayfield, so we're making a brand new park for Manchester, the first city park for 100 years. It's full of 140 different trees, 10,000 shrubs of different species. We've opened up the River Medlock, which was always there since the inception of Manchester. And it's a site which is rich with industrial heritage, and we've managed to do all sorts in terms of trying to be more sustainable in our approach to building the park. We reused loads of materials that we found on site and reduced 230 tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere. We found old Victorian wells which were used as part of breweries back in the day in the 17 and 1800s. And by reusing the wells, we were able to water the trees and the plants in the park, which is going to save a few tonnes of CO2 a year. And obviously there's an immense amount of benefit in having a park in a city centre. And I think over the last couple of years we've all grown to appreciate our green spaces a lot more. Manchester is quite a heavily built city. I don't think I'm wrong in saying that. Doesn't have great city parks, and we're really chuffed to be able to deliver one right in the heart of the city. And we're opening to the public later this year.
There were also some interesting techie people at the conference. I'm not usually particularly interested in technology, new technology for its own sake, but I love when people find a way to innovate and remove barriers to decarbonisation. Here's Martin Hale from Raw Charging explaining how they make it easy for landowners to get electric vehicle charging points installed.
Unlike petrol stations, EVs can be charged anywhere there's electricity. So there's the opportunity, wherever the car sits for long periods, or in some cases for short periods when they're on a longer route to exchange the range, we can install charging infrastructure. And we have three models. You can either buy it, and then we can manage that asset for the property owner, or they can rent it, and again, if necessary, we can manage it, or more interestingly, in some cases, we will actually fully fund it. And the way it's paid for is the driver pays, and we make a small margin on the kilowatt hour that pays for our investment in fully funded installations.
So I guess what is different about what you're doing compared to just other charging points you'd see around the place?
So what's probably the biggest difference is that typically you'll buy a charging station from a charging station manufacturer or an installer, whereas we are agnostic to the hardware and we subcontract the installation, and we're also consultants who deliver the turnkey, which means we do everything, solution. So this is why property companies love us to death, because they come to us, we'll do a feasibility study of what they should be doing and why. It's very holistic to a site, and then we say, this is what you should be doing, this is what it could cost you, this is what you could earn from it if we fund it. So they have all the information that's correct, rather than going out there to ask for a tender, for example, and saying, how much for this? And that's typically not the right solution they need.
At some point in my wanders around the conference, I found someone driving around what looked like a big remote-controlled car. Of course, I stopped for an interview.
Good afternoon, Ross. Hi, I'm Tim, and I'm from Qbot in London.
Excellent. So what is this, Qbot, and what problem are you trying to solve?
So Qbot, we're a 10-year-old company, and we insulate under your floor using a robot. So the methods before would be ripping up the floor, decanting the family, and putting down some crude method of insulation. But what we've decided is you haven't got to do that. We cut a robot-sized hole into your floor. Genuinely, we put the robot into the floor. The robot deploys a foam to the underside of your floor, giving you instant warmer feet, less need to be putting the heating on, and reduce bills.
Because I think that is one of the big things stopping barriers to people retrofitting their home, is that it is just such a big faff, and it means maybe moving out, it means a lot of disruption. How different is this? Like, how long does it take to actually do this?
Good question. Yeah, so average house in London takes about a day and a half, 2 days max. The team, once you're booked in, you have a survey. We call it a health survey, and the purpose of that survey is to make sure what we're installing on is installable. So what I mean by that is to make sure that the wood is not moist, is not damp, because if we spray on that, it's going to cause problems. We don't trap anything in. We make sure there's a cross-flow of ventilation so it can all breathe under there. We don't block the void. We simply block the areas of cold going into the house, which again reduces the need for the heating, and it also improves your EPC. So the difference really, it takes half the time. Family can work on your Teams call next door, no problem, they genuinely can. They can't work above the room because we need to have 60 minutes for it to settle, but they can work next door. And it works, and we're very busy at the moment, obviously getting busier. And this falls in line with decarbonisation, net zero. It's under that umbrella as well. So,
just for people who are listening, can you just describe actually what the robot looks like so they can sort of envision?
Yeah. So it's like the rover that you see on the moon. So the wheels are almost as big as half of the car. Picture a buggy, a moon buggy that can deploy foam. You can also Google Q-bot. That's us. Little plug there. And the robot itself visually, it's like a moon buggy. Is that cool enough?
So there's a snapshot of my day at the Footprint Plus conference in Brighton. There was so many other fascinating people there who I didn't get a chance to speak to. Michael Ritchie's architect's talk on Passive House was really inspiring. Something I took away from that is, in their experience, using a Passive House design approach is only 3 to 5% more expensive than building to normal building regs, which just shows that sustainable design, it doesn't really have to be any more expensive than business as usual. The Landscape Institute also held a fantastic talk about embodied carbon in landscape. We spend a lot of time focusing on architecture and are only now really starting to think about the carbon emissions associated with public realm and landscape design. I understand the Landscape Institute will be releasing a report on this soon, so I'll try to get someone on to speak about that. Thanks so much for listening. See you again in 2 weeks for a very special episode number 50 of the Green Urbanist podcast. Bye.